FNAF has been going through its second new coming for a while now, hasn't it? We've just gotten the announcement of a second new security breach game alongside another FNAF World game currently in the works from Megacat Studios, and wait, a real Freddy Fazbear's Pizza coming in New Jersey? Well, that's not good. Even after some of its fallbacks in recent years, the fan base is still as active as ever, and because of that, I wanted to talk about it. This is my first FNAF video after all, and it's not exactly going to be a theory video either. I'm sure you've seen plenty of people criticize what it has become over the recent years, and honestly, a lot of those criticisms still hold a lot of validity. There's been a pretty big divide between the old fans and the newer ones, especially with how this series has been approaching its overarching narrative. Especially when you look at what FNAF 6 actually accomplished. FNAF 3, 4, and even 5 all attempted to serve as possible endings for the series, but each one had its own problems that made them feel incomplete or unsatisfying as a true conclusion. FNAF 3 had a lackluster jump scare with Springtrap, while FNAF 4 tried to explain the origins of everything, but then that started to have its own problems. FNAF 6, however, actually committed to giving the series that ending. It brought all the major characters together and answered many of the questions that had been building up since the first game, and gave characters like William, Michael, and Henry, and even the puppet, conclusive arcs. And Ultimate Custom Night worked really well for a bonus ending. It's important when you remember how incredibly indie FNAF was back in the day. These games were being made with a much more smaller scope, yet they still managed to build toward a conclusion that felt deliberate. So when other fans start to criticize the series for continuing after that point forward, could you really legitimately blame them? There was a legitimate reason to believe that FNAF had already ended, and, doing anything more after that would really not be worth continuing. Not to mention all the mascot horror fatigue going on. But I don't think modern FNAF deserves to be dismissed entirely just because it isn't trying to be the same horror game anymore. Security Breach in particular introduced a lot of cool new ideas, and while I understand the criticism toward its gameplay and story, I still think there's a lot of fun in what it tried to do. The Mega Pizzaplex is one of my favorite examples of FNAF's world building and visual design, and I think there's a lot of potential in that direction if the series actually learns how to use it properly. I mean, I still find myself keeping up with the series. I haven't played Secret of the Mimic yet, so I can't really give my own thoughts on it, but I have ended up watching theory videos about it still. I think that says a lot about what makes FNAF so special in the first place. Even if the story has been dragged out far longer than many people expected, the lore is still one of the biggest reasons people stay invested. And even now, it's still doing surprisingly good at keeping the franchise engaged. So, how are we supposed to figure out an actual proper dilemma for this? Well, we've seen already something like this in the books. As you may know, The Silver Eyes was the first major spin-off novel from the franchise, taking place in a different continuity from the actual games. It follows Charlie, who returns to her hometown with a group of childhood friends years after the disappearance and murders of several children at Freddy's. What's interesting though is that this alternate universe still shares a lot of ideas and characters with the original games, just under a completely different circumstance. Charlie is a great example of this. While she isn't literally the same character as the puppet from the game, she's clearly a parallel to the character to the role that Charlie has within the game continuity. The same thing happens with William. His serial killer name ended up being revealed in Sister Location to be true. But get this, they also revealed the names of the missing children before FNAF 6. So even though these aren't all the exact same characters between continuities, the books were still able to introduce information that ended up becoming extremely relevant to how we understood the games. Eventually, FNAF expanded even further with literature, giving the franchise another way to grow while still letting Scott and the writers explore ideas, such as the Fazbear Frights, an anthology of the short stories that worked almost like FNAF's version of Goosebumps. I mean, Into the Pit was one of those games that ended up becoming a part of the actual franchise. And that's what I think it could have taken advantage of more. The books didn't always need to tell us exactly what happened in the games, they gave us different interpretations of the same ideas while leaving the actual game timeline intact. Yes, there are a lot of problems with the books, but they never ended up getting a lot of backlash for them from the fans because they were never actually canon. I think this is where my proposition comes in. What if, from the very beginning of FNAF VR, there was still a way to redirect the story similarly to the books without having to compromise the original timeline? I mean, think about it. Ever since we got VR, the story started diving into this meta-narrative where the events of the original games were treated as nothing more than plausible events that may or may not have actually happened within the universe. The idea was that there was essentially a parallel version of Scott who made up the original FNAF games in-universe, supposedly based on rumors and real tragedies surrounding Fazbear Entertainment. So the games we had already played weren't necessarily the actual events, or may have actually been the events, but we don't know that for sure. They were fictional games that existed within FNAF's world, creating this strange layer where our own reality was now being incorporated into the franchise. I mean, FNAF AR pushed this idea even further by directly playing with that boundary between the games and our supposed reality. And honestly, I've always found that a little bothersome because of how out of touch and over the top it felt. Don't get me wrong, I really love how ambitious the franchise was becoming at the time, and the highly advanced sci-fi elements completely caught me off guard. It felt like FNAF was finally going beyond where the original story left off, which I thought was really cool at the time, but I can't help feeling like it leaves a bad taste in my mouth when I think about what was left behind. Scott did originally have a different story in mind from what Steelwool did when Security Breach released, which could have possibly still saved the series in some way, but can we really still put in the benefit of the doubt that it won't still mess with the continuity? I don't necessarily think expanding the series was a bad idea, I just think they could have used the books as an example of how to do it while still keeping the new story consistent and interesting. Maybe the FNAF games introduced through VR could have actually been a good opportunity to do this, creating a new version of events inspired by the original games without making those original games part of this new continuity. That way, the story could have explored new ideas and events without erasing or recontextualizing everything. We wouldn't have to constantly question what was canon, point out retcons, or find explanations for how the new story connects back to something that was already finished. Now, you might be thinking about how this would fall apart if we actually decided to do it this way. I mean, Secret of the Mimic has given us a huge expansion to FNAF's original story and made the universe even more interesting, with giving us more context with Edwin being a major part of Freddy's origins. But I still think there's something divisive about continuing to expand on those original events. It can compromise some of the original intent of the Scott era, but more importantly, it risks taking away one of the interesting parts of FNAF, which is its intrigue and mystery, especially when it comes to the original continuity. And that's what I think they need to dive into next. Because I really think that if we keep pushing the story forward by constantly explaining and expanding on everything that came before, we're eventually going to lose that mystery. That's why I believe making the new storyline with the advanced technology for a new timeline could actually work. This would let us explore the new lore in a fresh way for us to solve. And yes, I know the original games would still need to exist for modern FNAF to actually work. And I'm not saying we shouldn't use them, I'm saying that they could still serve a different purpose. We could still use those original games as a hypothetical interpretation for the original story, but with the possibility that some of those things didn't necessarily happen exactly the way they were portrayed. That way we'd still have those familiar details to recognize and theorize about, while keeping the mystery fresh by leaving it ambiguous whether everything actually happened the way we saw it in the games. I know a lot of people are going to be unhappy with the other things that it has put their direction in recently, mostly focusing maybe on the horror aspect being gone from the original, but my main argument for this video is rather trying to find a mediating solution for both new fans and original hardcore horror fans. That way we can keep the integrity of the game still intact. With everything I've mentioned so far, just think about how many new revelations could be explored with these ideas. The lore could be a lot more clear now. Maybe Vanessa could finally have a reason to potentially be Elizabeth in this universe, especially with the things that we've seen in the movie so far. Gregory could potentially be the crying child without having to make him a robot, because the bite of 83 might not have actually happened in the timeline. We could explore Edwin's history and his connection to the Mimic while still leaving the conclusion of FNAF 6 intact. They could even give us more context for things like why the blob still exists, or how Afton could still be alive, present as an AI. Maybe Afton had a different reason of existing in here. At the end of the day, you don't need to reset everything just because people claim that's what they want. It might be fun to see a complete reinterpretation of the story someday, but what we got from the beginning was already good. We can still preserve the story the way it was, while continuing forward with something completely new to tell. Alternate universes have always been a great way to do this, especially when you have someone new taking over and wanting to expand upon someone else's work. And unfortunately, I think we also have to admit that Scott isn't exactly the strongest writer. I think that's already clear enough with how he's been making the FNAF movies. Ultimately though, it is Steelwool and Scott's decision on where they want to bring and take the story next. Maybe eventually they will end up getting back on its feet and fix things up on their own properly. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments down below your thoughts. I'm always open-minded to hear. Thanks for watching. I hope it wasn't too much of a surprise to see me make something a little different this time around. I promise I do have another Deltarune video on the works that I have to take a lot of time on, but I want to try something different to expand my horizons of the channel more and to see where I can also bring it into a different direction if I ever feel like moving on from Deltarune, and see if the audience would want to see more other stuff like this. But as always, reach for the stars.